Welcome to everyone who has joined us. We are thrilled to have you here for the third act, a conversation with Anthony Brooks. My name is Seth Green, and on a morning like this one, I'm especially grateful to say I'm the dean here at the Graham School at the University of Chicago. And I want to welcome you to our gorgeous campus this morning, a place where big ideas are born that continue to shape and reimagine the world. And I am grateful to welcome you to the Graham School in particular, where we are now 134 years young in our mission for promoting lifelong learning, a topic that we will be going into today as part of the journey for discerning a third act. I'll just call your attention that we have many other exciting conversations coming up. We have next month a fireside chat with Michael Fashnot, who is our leader for the Chicago Leadership Circle, about how individuals and institutions can be part of really contributing to the economic and community development of our region. We will have our Graham School annual report, where you can not only hear about what happened in the last year, but more importantly, shape what's happening in the year ahead. And we'll have our basic program info session toward the end of next month. And I also just want to note that summer courses are open. You can see in the chat momentarily the opportunities in September for the 3-week term that we have that still has availability. But the reason you are all here, and I'm going to take down my screen, is for our conversation with Anthony Brooks. Anthony brings more than 30 years of experience in public radio, working as a producer, editor, reporter, and host for WBUR and NPR. Before becoming WBUR senior political reporter, he was co-host of Radio Boston. He was also a senior producer on the team that launched The World for Public Radio International. Over the years, he has won many awards, including the Edward R. Murrow Regional Broadcasters Award and the AP Broadcasters Award. And today we are talking with him about his series on the third act, which we found fascinating. And so, Anthony, I want to get started by asking you what drew you to reinvention in midlife and beyond and led you to build this really important series for WBUR.
Oh, well, thanks, Seth, and thanks for having me. And good question to kick things off. I mean, I guess I'm sort of a restless soul. I think I'm even though I've been, 40 years in this career, I'm still always sort of trying to figure out what I want to do when I grow up. So I think that's sort of at the base of this. I mean, I just love the idea of reinvention. And I guess about 15 years ago, I started paying attention to stories about people who managed to reinvent themselves in interesting and inspirational ways later in life. I'd gone through a health scare. My dad had died. They all felt like sort of flashing yellow lights of middle age, reminders that a lot more life behind me than ahead. And so I started thinking about the best way to live out, what was left. And this curiosity drew me to these stories. And I want to give credit to a colleague from the New York Times named Kit Seeley. She did a wonderful story about a guy named Tom Andrew, who was the medical examiner in New Hampshire. He had a full career as a doctor, including 20 years as the state's chief medical examiner. And he got to a point where he just had enough. He was overwhelmed by the opioid addiction crisis. He was tired of looking at dead bodies of young people, and he'd just had enough. But he wasn't ready to stop working. So he enrolled in seminary school to become a Methodist deacon and youth pastor. And he did that in his mid-60s. And, as he's told me, he was done with his medical profession, but he still had plenty of energy and passion left. So by the time I'd did the story on him a couple of years back, he was ministering to his local Boy Scout troop in New Hampshire and really found new purpose in his life. So I think it was stories like that drew me to other stories. And that's when I got the idea to launch a series, because there's a whole bunch of data about how we're living longer and a whole bunch of other stuff that we can talk about as this conversation continues. But it turns out a lot of people are doing what Tom Andrew did, and that just really intrigued me. And I wanted to get at who these people were and why they were doing it.
Well, so you've talked to a lot of people, looked into their stories, told them beautifully. I want to go through some of them, but before we jump into specific examples, I want to get your high level on what are the themes that you saw consistently showing up across individuals who had successful third acts.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this idea that Tom Andrew expressed that he'd sort of come to a natural end of his normal career, but still had plenty of gas left in the tank. And with that gas, he could fuel the next chapter that might not have anything to do with his first career. And there's some interesting facts and trends that underlie all of this. One of them has to do with life expectancy. A little over a century ago, the life expectancy in the US was about 47 years. Today it hovers around 80. So that means we've added 30 years of life to the average life. If you've got a little bit of good health on your side, maybe some good genetics on your side. That means the traditional idea of three stages of life, learning, earning, and retiring, is really outdated. And instead, lots of people, like Tom Andrew, are discovering that life can reset at age 50, 60, 70, or even later. And there's this interesting and I think inspiring idea that people who study this phase of life talk about, and it's called middlescence. And like adolescence, middlescence can be a time of change and tumult later in life, but it's also an opportunity for growth. And it's important to think about these extra years not as more years to be old, but rather an extension of that middle phase of life where you can still be active and create something new. So, for example, for this series, I interviewed Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot. She's a professor of education at Harvard, and she wrote a wonderful book which really helped me do this series. It was called The Third Chapter: Passion, Risk, and Adventure in the 25 Years After 50. And she interviewed dozens of folks like Tom Andrew who chose new careers or adapted new skills later in life. And the way she talks about this this phase of life is potentially incredibly generative and transformational, maybe the most transformational time in our lives if we take advantage of it. And by this period of life, she's talking about the years between 50 and 75. So that was sort of that had a lot to do with the focus of my stories.
So let's go into some of the stories. Were there any that particularly surprised or moved you? And can you tell us a couple? And then we'll go through a little bit deeper into kind of
Yeah.
what you saw play out.
Well, one of the things I was aware of is that, you can talk about this idea of a third act of applying only to a sort of certain socioeconomic set of people, if you will. That is, people who have the means to sort of stop working and reinvent themselves and do something later in life. And that's not always easy for everybody. But what I discovered that is there are a lot of people who are wealthy who are doing this. There are people who are not as wealthy who are figuring out a way to do this as well. And one of the stories I looked at was about a woman named Natalie Jones. She grew up in Boston. When I interviewed her a few years back, she was 76. She grew up working class in Boston, the granddaughter of Italian immigrants. And she was raised with the belief that she just wasn't smart enough to go to college. That was pretty much the conversation around the dinner table growing up. And as a young adult, she got married. She had two kids. She found herself, then she was divorced. She found herself struggling as a single mother, working a succession of low-paying jobs. And eventually she found herself attending counseling sessions for single parents like her. And she began volunteering to help run these sessions. And she discovered she was pretty good at talking to people and helping them through the kind of challenges that she was dealing with. And at the age of 59, she finally sort of overcame this belief that had been sort of hammered into her that she's not smart enough to go to college. And she went to college. And then she went on to graduate school. And she earned a master's degree in social work and began a new career as a social worker in her early 60s and told me that, she plans to keep on working well into her 80s. So that's a story that I just love, of someone who really, really reinvented themselves, in this later phase of life. And it certainly wasn't ordained that she was going to be going in this direction. It took a real effort on her part, but it was a wonderful story of reinvention. And the last time I visited her, she was sort of living the dream and had bought a condo on the South Shore, south of Boston, with a view of the ocean, which had been her lifelong dream, and sort of a lovely story.
A lovely story. And I want to now walk through how to engage a third act, because you've seen a lot of people do it like Natalie. And I want to start where individuals start, which is some sense that it may be the right time to take a leap into something new. And you've described this already, Anthony, at a high level, that some individuals may feel like they have a readiness to finish their longstanding career, but still have gas in the tank. I imagine there are other ways, though, that people come to this discernment that it's time for something new. Can you talk about step one of this process, which is the discernment that a change or an entry into this adolescence may be an important feature for them, and how people come to that sense in their
Yeah,
50s, 60s, 70s?
yeah. Yeah, let me throw this out as well, because there's sort of some facts that kind of back this up. I mean, why so many people are doing it. We were, Seth, right before we started this conversation, we were talking about 10,000 baby boomers reaching retirement age every day. Um, but a lot of them, aren't ready to stop working, either because they can't afford to, like Natalie Jones, or like Tom Andrew, because they don't want to. Um, so if you look at someone at age 65 or older now, this comes from Richard Johnson, who's a senior fellow at the Program on Retirement Policy at the Urban Institute. And so he tells me that if you look at someone age 65 or older now, that person is 75% more likely to be working than someone who was in the same age group a generation ago.
Wow.
So
75% more. So
yeah,
nearly
75%
doubling the
more.
number of people in that category who are working.
Yeah. So, and according to the US Census Bureau, the number of Americans living into their 90s in 2050 is expected to be 4 times higher than it was in 1980. So that's an extraordinary number. Just tons of people living into their 90s that just weren't doing so before. So if you're 45, you may have half your life ahead of you. So I think that kind of creates this moment, or this increasingly frequent moment, of people getting into this. Um, but I'm sorry, you asked me a question. I was leading
Well,
toward
yeah,
the
no,
answer
so
to your
you're
question, but
getting
now I
into
can't
it.
remember what
So
the question was.
so how do people come to this discernment? And part of it is, right, to your point, they realize they have a lot of time left and
Yeah,
they want to use that time. And I mean, I think to your point, Anthony, it's very different if you're reaching 65 and say I have 10 years, right? And an imagination of reinvention is going to be very difficult, because you're going to
yeah,
say, by the time I go through college and my master's, I'm done, right? How am I going to
yeah,
use this degree? Where you're living 90, 95, right? That's a totally different equation. You say, okay, I may want to go after a bachelor's degree I'd always dreamed of, because I'll have time to use it potentially. So that's definitely a big piece of the puzzle, is that the horizon people are thinking about is longer and arguably allows 2 acts now. But I want to go deeper than that, because I think that's a part of the puzzle. I think there's also this yearning that you're describing, and I'm curious if you could describe kind of how people come to imagine that they could do something different. What is, if you've seen it across people, what is that spark that may
yeah.
be getting to people?
Well, the people who I interview, all sort of share this wonderful sense of satisfaction, for doing these, when they do these third acts, because in a way they're doing them for the right reason. In most cases, their kids have grown up, they've already done a full career, so in a sense, they've got nothing left to prove, so they can really focus on work that has significant meaning to them. And they had a sense of wisdom, and in many cases a desire to give back. They weren't working to fulfill a quota or to maximize a paycheck. They were really working to express their passion and to sustain their souls. So that's something that I think people get to. If you've worked one career for 25, 30, or even 40 years, in a way, it liberates you to kind of move on to the next thing. At least that's what I've found in talking to these people. They've just gotten to a point where they're ready to do to sort of live that dream, if you will, that they haven't been able to do up until that point. And I was really, it was really sort of inspirational to spend time with them, and to hear those stories. But I think it really has to do with this idea of living one part of your kind of productive adulthood and then getting to that point where you have the courage and the wherewithal to take this plunge and doing something that your soul really calls you to do.
So before we jump into some of the benefits and the satisfaction that you're describing, I do want to look at what are the challenges. And
Yeah,
I know from talking to a lot of people that are engaging third acts and ultimately come out on the other side really satisfied that it is emotionally trying. I mean, you
try
use
absolutely.
adolescence, it draws on adolescence. I remember adolescence. I now have happy memories, but I am convinced that is just my memory playing tricks on me because I know during those moments it was not always 100% joyful. And so can you talk a little bit about in this middle lessons, what are some of the emotional challenges and barriers to starting over later in life?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think challenge is the right word because for a lot of people, this can be a difficult transition. You're leaving what you've become very good at and have a lot of experience doing and taking on something new, and in many ways starting from the beginning. So to go back to Tom Andrew, to become a Methodist deacon in his early 60s, he had to go back to school. He went to seminary school. He sat for exams. He had to have a whole series of interviews with church leaders. And, he talked about the frustration with church bureaucracy. I mean, this was a guy who ran his own office as the state's chief medical examiner, and he had to go back and be humble. At the same time, he says his third act ended up being quite liberating. Um, but to go back to what Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, the professor of education at Harvard, who wrote that book about third act, she talks about this being potentially liberating as well, but also difficult at the outset because these third acts require a leap into the unknown. And for older people, that task can be particularly daunting. They face learning new skills, maybe even giving up status as they transition from, an experienced elder to an older beginner, I guess you could say. So, but, I think really what this comes down to, this process of growing and leaping into that third act, is taking risks and being willing to be vulnerable. And then I think when you get to the other side of that, you feel this sense of payoff.
One thing I know that you've looked a little bit at is how community and mentorship and forces around individuals help shape sometimes their journey and support them in the difficult process of coming into this next stage. Can you talk all about the role of community in helping individuals to both discern what may be next and then to activate that vision?
That's interesting. I have to think hard about that because the sense that I got is, these people are sort of pushing back against what, in a lot of ways, what community expects. I mean, I think we're still living in a world where there is this expectation that, once you retire, you kind of are on this downward slope to the to the sort of sad conclusion of where life brings all of us. So I really had the sense that these people are, pushing back in many ways against what is expected and what the community around them. I mean, to go back to Natalie Jones, I mean, she grew up in this world where, she was just told flat out, people like us don't go to college, so just give up on that dream. So the sense that I get is that lots of people who do these third acts really have to push against that expectation. And, they have to be willing to take that leap, and, maybe embrace a little humility as well, because if you've been at the top of your game and the top of your profession, you're starting over again. It can be a slightly humbling road that you have to follow until you sort of get where you want that third act to take you. Does
Yeah,
that
we
make
have
sense?
makes total sense. We have a professor here, Harry Davis, who teaches at our Booth School and also in our Leadership and Society initiative, which supports individuals in this transition into a meaningful next chapter. And he has an analogy of traveling lightly. And he describes when you go to a new destination,
Yeah.
you can't take everything with you or you'll be weighed down by the baggage. You also don't want to travel naked. And so you want to go and you want to be really intentional about what identities, what assets have I built up, what skills do I want to bring, and then what do I want to let go of? And I think one of the most challenging aspects is for people that have had a really cherished identity, even though that identity may have served them really well until this point, it may not serve them well to hang on to it and to feel like they need to use it almost as a warrior shield in this next chapter. And so, how do they let go of it? And the analogy of traveling lightly actually comes from his own experience. He was a marketing professor, went into the dean's office at Booth, then came out into his office again, and he got very interested in leadership and realized he didn't have enough room for his books to go from the bigger dean's office back to his regular professor's office. And so he
Huh.
decided he wasn't going to bring his marketing books, even though that was his career until he started teaching about leadership. He was only going to bring leadership books, and it allowed him to really go into the next 30 years of his role as a faculty member, focus on leadership as his guide. And for him, that was a memory that really served him well. But at the time, giving up these books that had really formed him was very difficult, as you might expect for an academic. I
Well,
want to, yeah,
it's
go for it.
interesting that you mentioned traveling lightly because that sort of brings to mind another story that I did
Yeah,
about a third act. Juliana Richardson, wonderful woman out in Chicago, she runs something called History Makers, which is
yeah,
a really ambitious project to collect audio visual stories of Black Americans. And she's gotten everyone from Ernie Banks to Barack Obama to Maya Angelou, and it's really an impressive collection. But her story is so interesting because she was someone who, a Black woman who grew up in rural Kansas and was very aware as a young woman that her history, her background just wasn't reflected in the world that she grew up on. And that really affected her at a young age. And it's something that she carried into college. She went to Brandeis. And but she was on this track to go to Harvard and to go to law school because that's what her dad wanted her to go. And she ended up becoming a corporate lawyer and working in Chicago. But she never felt at home in the corporate world, but she stuck it out and then had a classic midlife crisis. I mean, she just couldn't do it anymore. She left the corporate world. She tried her hand at being an entrepreneur. She tried setting up a home shopping network in the middle in Chicago. It didn't work out because the cable TV industry was in flux. Anyway, classic sort of middle-essence opportunity or midlife crisis, depending on your point of view. She used this crisis really well because she sort of went back to this dream of creating this archive of video interviews with prominent Black Americans that sort of went back to this absence that she felt as a young kid growing up in Kansas. And now this library is huge. It's in the Library of Congress. It's accessible at universities and colleges all across the country. And, she made this shift in her, I think, mid to late 50s, and she's never been happier. And it's just such a great story about the sort of transformative power of this middlescent crisis, if you will. And one of the people who studies sort of midolescence actually takes issue with the idea of midlife crisis because this is to your point, Seth, that you were making a while ago. We don't talk about adolescence as being a crisis. It's difficult as it is, full of tumult and everything. It's a transitional moment. And we know these young people are going to come out on the other side and turn into adults. Well, she's this gerontologist named Barbara Waxman, who I interviewed, talks about midolescence in the same way. Don't think of it as a crisis. Think of it as a sort of churning, moment of change and
yeah.
use it for productive ends to get to the other side into that sort of new way of expressing your passions and who you are.
Anthony, a common experience I think you're describing, and you said this in the answer about community, is individuals trying to overcome the expectations that have been put on them
Yeah.
and really come to their own inner guide for what motivates them. And David Brooks, who's also a faculty member with us, talks a lot about this in his book, The Second Mountain, that individuals need to kind of give up that first mountain, which may be set by others and which may be about fulfilling expectations of society, whether it's to become, the corporate lawyer that your parents want, or, the examiner who owns his own office, and really setting that for yourself. But one of the challenges is that if you've had 20, 30, 40 years, especially of accomplishment, where you've really gotten good at meeting external benchmarks and almost your identity is intertwined with those external benchmarks, it can be very hard to have that internal locus of incentive and control anymore. Can you talk about how people found that? I mean, you're describing in this example someone who it took literally being, kind of, thrown into this valley where,
Yeah.
they are unhappy as a corporate lawyer. They're not able to make it with this, shopping. And so then they end up there. But, how do people come to this? Are there ways to come to this that are less, I know we don't want to use the term crisis, but less value oriented than that? And how have you seen that play out over time?
That's interesting because, to go back to that example of Juliana Richardson, she's an example of a third act where, she's just completely shifted direction and doing something completely different than she had been doing. But a lot of these stories are related to what you're talking about. And someone put this idea in my head that we're talking about the same seed, but a different plant. In other words,
Yeah.
there's a pattern in some of these stories. That is, we are who we are. So in a way, third acts allow us to express ourselves in new ways. So if you go back to Tom Andrew, for example, he was a doctor, he was a healer. And yes, he came up with a third act as becoming a Methodist deacon. It's a new career, but he's still helping people. He's trying to reach younger people. And he was quite explicit about this. He said after seeing the ravages of the opioid addiction crisis, he wanted to minister to young people before they reach for those recreational drugs that might take them down that dark path. So, I think some of the people who figure out a third act maybe more seamlessly, like Tom Andrews seemed to do, as opposed to coming through a kind of middlescent crisis. It's kind of an extension. It's a different branch of the same kind of tree that they'd planted earlier. This, I guess you could say the same was true for Natalie Jones. The first part of her life was a struggle to make a living, to be a single parent. So her third act was to become a counselor to help people with those kinds of struggle. So sometimes I've set this series up as, people who have reinvented themselves in completely different ways. But probably in most cases, it's not completely different. It might look completely different superficially, but if you sort of drill down into it, it turns out they're kind of finding new ways to do the sort of core mission of their life, if you will.
Now, your series is a, upbeat series that looks at these stories of individuals who have found this satisfaction and made it through the third act. I'm curious, though, if you've seen some real misses in terms of how people approach their third act and any lessons that we might learn from maybe people eventually finding it, but taking much longer than they would have liked to have found their way through to the third act.
You know, it's a great question, but I don't have stories about people who made misses, probably partly because the way I researched this was, I literally put out a call on social media for people to sort of tell me their third act stories.
Right. And
So
the
I
people
had
with
this sort
terrible
of wealth of,
stories, right?
yeah, I sort of had this, this I guess you call it observation bias. All of the stories that I've been reading and hearing just sort of prove that this can be done. But clearly, I'm aware that this is hard going. And, when I think about my own third act, which is something I'm always dreaming of, I'm much more aware of how difficult this is because I've been doing something a certain way for 40 years as a journalist. And it kind of, I feel a little bit frozen by the idea of giving that up and doing something completely different. So that's sort of my point of view about that. But I actually don't have stories about people's sort of third act efforts that have sort of crashed and burned, but I'm sure they're out there.
We have an interesting question in the chat. How can we support parents going into their third act? I don't know if you have seen any people that are still parenting. I imagine, though,
Oh,
that at the
interesting.
least you've
Yeah.
seen people that are caregiving because of the sandwich effect and people that might be caregiving
Yeah.
upward. But can you talk at all about how to think about the third act in the context of some of those responsibilities? Is it possible in your mind? I mean, what you've described so far is a lot of people embracing their third act once those other commitments that they have, like parenting, are complete. But I don't know if you've seen this, during these moments
I
potentially.
haven't actually. I mean, I do think, the stories that I've encountered, have to do with a lot of people taking on these third acts after the responsibility of parenting is behind them. I mean, one of the sort of more delightful stories that I got to do was a story about an all-girl rock band called the Ace of Cups, and I just love this story. So the Ace of Cups, five women back in the 1960s in San Francisco started an all-girl rock band. That's the way they identified themselves, as an all-girl rock band. And it was unusual back then. The culture almost didn't know what to make of them, but they had success. They played with opened for Jimi Hendrix. They toured with Jefferson Airplane, and they were on their way to being a success. But the industry didn't really know what to do with this band, and because of sexism and other expectations. I mean, there were female vocalists, people like Janis Joplin, but there weren't female rock and roll musicians playing like they did. So to make a long story short, they never managed to record an album, and they went their separate ways. They broke up, and they had to take care of kids and families, but they stayed in touch, and every now and then they got together again. And 50 years after they broke up, they were playing, and a record producer heard them and said, "Oh my God, you guys are amazing. I want to record you." They got a record contract 50 years after they first
Oh,
started. So, their third act, it wasn't really consistent with a lot of the other stories that I told, because it's not like they started something new. But in
right.
their third act, once sort of the demands of family and kids had kind of died down, they were able to kind of reach back and re-embrace the sort of passion and the sort of artistic soul, if you will, that they had to sort of abandon because of this inability to land a contract 50 years ago, and the demands of family. So I sort of feel that these third act stories, come into existence after that first phase of life has sort of passed by, and kids are grown up, and in a way we can sort of become a little bit selfish and focus more on our own passions. And it's an important thing, because one of the things that I I really came to believe is that, this is a matter of life or death in a sense, because we do much better as older people, if we have these passions. I mean, there are all kinds of studies that support this. So it's something that I just, am wild about in terms of, appreciating the significance of people who do this.
We have one more question that someone privately chatted me here, which is about how you can help individuals potentially come to realize a third act is possible. This person asks, as an adult child, wants to support their parents
Oh,
in
that's great.
realizing that. But I also wonder that for a spouse, have you seen interventions, so to speak, Anthony, where it sounds like a lot of the individuals so far have their own spark? Are there
Yeah.
places where someone else helps to come to them and say, if you're not happy with this, or have you thought about this? Because I do know, and I don't know if you see this, that part of this is getting the timing right. I mean, I've seen people that succeed with their third act sometimes coming to this a little bit earlier. It's still
Yeah.
possible when you're 70, but I think it can be tougher. And sometimes I think it can be hard for people to let go. But if they want to have a next act, coming to it when they're 55, 60, something like that allows them more time and versatility. And we still live in an ageist world where I think there are more open doors, even though that should not be that way. I'm curious if you have thoughts on, interventions by people around you that may love you, that are coming to you to think about a third act with you.
You know, this hits me. This sort of strikes me in a personal way, because there was someone in my family, someone older, who I think died younger than he should have, who I was very close to. And I think it was precisely because he didn't have a way to sort of engage with the world in some interest bigger than himself in his later years. And I spent a lot of time sort of urging him. He was a very talented writer. There was lots of things he could have done, but I was unsuccessful in doing that. So I don't know what the answer. It's a great question. I mean, I think if there's someone in your life who is older, I mean, I think all you can do is to urge them to have the courage to take this leap. I mean, that's the only intervention that I can that I can imagine, because it really is. It's so important, and there's all kinds of ways to express how important it is. One of my younger colleagues asked me why Gen Z should care about these stories that I was doing. And I had a few answers to that question. I told her that if we're lucky, we will all one day become an older person. So here's a chance to learn
Right.
something about the road ahead from wise people who've already traveled it. To put it another way, wisdom matters. And then, to go back to this idea, is that these stories are about the transformative power of human passion and the search for lifelong avocation. And as I alluded to before, this is literally about life and death. I mean, people who feel that they have a purpose in life live longer, and that's according to a whole bunch of research. So I think if you can just find a loving way to communicate that to, the older people in your life, like your life doesn't have to be over right now, and there's so much more to give and so much more for you to learn and to do, you'd be doing them a big favor. But the sense that I got from the stories that I've done, this came from
Right
this
within.
came from within these people. And I think it is an act of courage ultimately, and bravery to sort of take the plunge, if you will.
I think it is. And I'll just share, Anthony, that I think one of our hopes with Leadership and Society Initiative is to form community that normalizes this reinvention. Because I think
Yeah.
that when you see people around you who are doing this and you hear their stories and their vulnerabilities and their insecurities alongside their confidence in what's next, I think it reduces the level of bravery you need to
Yeah.
engage in this because you see the possibility. And I will say one of our goals in higher education is in some ways to think about the structure of adulthood. And by creating these paths and making it normal to go back in school as part of your learning journey at many stages of life, it hopefully reduces the sense of this is a risk-taking behavior because there are lots of people doing it, sometimes failing, sometimes finding their ways. But kind of like adolescence is a real stage in life. And so even if you're feeling angst as a teen, you say, well, of course I'm feeling angst. Everyone feels angst at this age.
Right.
If
Right.
we can normalize that structure of adulthood, it may help us to move forward. I have a question here from Alice Davison. I'm interested in any structural changes you think could be helpful pre-third act so that longer lives and next chapters become normalized. Do you see
Oh, yeah.
opportunities?
I have a great thought, I believe, about this, because it's actually it's a conversation that I'm beginning to have with my boss. What I think a lot of uh, places of work lack is a kind of gradual off ramp for people of a certain age. And I'll present myself as an example. So I'm 67. I've reached that traditional retirement age, but I don't want to retire, because for all the reasons that we've been talking about. But I would like to have a conversation with my employers about what's the structure that we can create within this organization that creates a sort of gradual, maybe off ramp for people of my age. We still have a lot to offer in terms of, we have a lot of younger employees coming in. I've been working in public radio for 40 years, so I'm in a position where I can mentor a lot of these folks. But we don't really have a set of structures and policies that kind of create that. We bring in younger employees, we onboard them, we talk about opportunities to promote and move on, and that's all really important. But what are we doing for folks who want to remain productive but are approaching the end of their sort of first career? How can we create structures for them within traditional work organizations that both maximize the sort of wisdom and experience that they've accrued, but also give them a sort of gradual path into whatever their third act is going to be? Because one thing I've come to believe in talking to people who have done these third acts and also watching some of my colleagues sort of cut the cord and retire is if you don't have a plan, that makes it a lot harder. In other
Yeah.
words, I have friends who have stopped journalism sort of overnight and then kind of regret it and are kind of lost, if you will. So my advice to people is if you're getting close to retirement, don't just cut loose without a plan. Think about what that transition is before you leave that job. And keep in mind that there are a lot of ways to define a third act as well. But I would like to see employers, places of business, sort of get involved in that in a more sort of structural and organized way.
We have a chicken or egg question here from fellow Bostonian David Yamada. He asks, in your interviewing experience, did the third act tend to clarify after a decision to retire, or did the draw of a specific third act inspire the retirement decision? Right? So are
Oh,
these people retiring and trying to find a third act, or are they so passionate about what's next that that is what leads them to retire?
oh, that's interesting. I I think it's the latter. I mean, I think it's something that they have sort of bubbling up inside of them that they just haven't been able to express in the course of their regular career. And their regular career has just sort of run its course. They've done everything. There's not that sense of newness. So I think it's that desire to sort of do the next thing that becomes the more overriding motivation to do the third act. That's the
Is
sense that
there
I got.
Is there a pattern in these third acts? We have a question here from Arlene, where it's something necessarily about social impact, given the issues faced by our communities? Or, I mean, do you see some people where their third act is they want to make more money in a certain way and they're just excited to have a serial enterprise or experience? Is there something about this act that necessarily means the purpose is directed in a social impact direction?
Yeah, I mean, I just find that there's so many different stories. Going back to Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot's book about this, she interviewed like dozens of folks. She just had very sort of brief accounts of them, but it was interesting because, you know, um, they included like an industrial chemist who became a sculptor in his late 60s, a former journalist and newspaper executive who turned into a jazz pianist, a 60-year-old physicist who went on to teach science to low-income teens. So I feel like there are many reasons for why people are doing this, as there are individual stories. As it happens, the people that I looked at, I think were by and large interested in sort of social impact. I mean, when I think of Tom Andrew becoming a Methodist deacon, he definitely wanted to sort of make the world around him a better place, a safer place for kids. Julianne Richardson, who set up History Makers, said sort of emphatically to me, when you reach a certain age, you have to start asking the question, what is your leave behind? How am I going to make this world a better place? So that really motivated her. Natalie Jones, who struggled as a single mother and someone who had been told she could never go to college, really wanted to figure out how to help people like her make their way in the world. So I think while that sort of wanting to improve the world um, does explain a lot of people's decision, I don't think it explains everybody's decisions. I'm thinking about the journalist and newspaper executive turned jazz pianist. I mean, there's no question that another jazz pianist in the world does make the world a better place, but obviously he's thinking about, his
Right.
personal artistic expression as opposed to, how do I end world hunger? So there are a lot of, I think there are all kinds of reasons to do this.
We have our final question here from Philip Torres. He writes, for those already committed to the third act but searching. And I feel like we see a lot of those individuals at the university because they come to learn here,
Yeah.
partly because they know they have more gas in the tank, but they're not sure where to direct it. He asks, have you seen any effective process to effectively execute the search and ramp to the third act? So for those individuals who have a yearning, but they're not sure where it's directed, how do they navigate? What's their compass? How do they figure out the map that they want to
It's
head.
interesting. You know, there are some resources out there, and there's a story that I actually want to do, and I'll throw this out as an idea to the person who asked the question. And unfortunately, I'm blanking on the name of the institution. But there's a guy named Chip Conley who
Yeah,
was
Modern
in
Elder Academy.
Modern Elder Academy. That is, I so want to go out to Baja California and do that story. But I mean, I think an organization like that would have a lot of answers, a lot of answers in terms of how you find yourself and how you kind of define a third act. I'm very, very interested in that. And I'm interested in, if there are other organizations that do that. I mean, it sounds like you folks out
Right.
there in
We are.
Chicago are
Yeah.
engaged in this in a deep and wonderful way.
Yeah, and I'll just put in the chat here Leadership for Society, which is an initiative specifically built on the same principles, but with a liberal arts focus and using great books and other big picture ideas as a guide to finding your way. With the idea, Anthony, that if you had people across time and space asking these questions and answering them, that reading their ideas is a starting place for discerning your own.
Yeah.
This has been a phenomenal session. Thank you for doing this report. I
Oh, you're
hope that you
welcome.
find the wellness yourself in this journey. You are hopefully not just going to have reported on this, but as you get maybe your gradual off ramp and ramp into your third act, hopefully you will find that having this purpose serves you as well as the broader society that you've helped to enrich through this series.
Well, thank you. I mean, you're really kind. Thank you for asking me to participate in this. It's really fun. It's just, yeah, it's a journey that I'm very excited about. And while I'm still not 100% sure where my third act is going to take me, it'll probably have something to do with storytelling and some of the skills that I've accrued. But I admit as well that, we talked about the challenge and sort of having the courage to take the plunge. And I know I have to work on sort of developing some of that courage to sort of take the next step. And so that's one of the challenges that I'm focused on. But thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you, and may you thrive in adolescence, as they
Okay.
say.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Seth.
you all. Bye.
Bye bye.